we had a wonderful pit bull named Tembi. And when she would see a rabbit and get all excited. And what was so interesting to me is that her nose would be to the ground and she was searching for that rabbit. But because her nose was to the ground, she wasn't noticing that the rabbit actually just fled away. And had she glanced up, she would have been able to at least chase it more effectively.
Right.
And
Right.
it occurred to me that that's kind of what we're doing with climate,
Yeah.
that we are so focused on carbon, on CO2, that we are missing the real story of climate. And actually, I think it's useful to think of many stories of climate are operating simultaneously.
Yeah.
It's not just one story.
Judith, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you this lovely autumn morning?
Well, I'm well, and I'm in Bennington, Vermont, where we are also having a beautiful, beautiful day. It's a little bit warm for my liking because
Right.
my wiring is for how the climate used to be.
Right. And it wouldn't be warm at
And
this time of year? Or it wouldn't be as warm at this time of year?
it would be a different flavor of warm. There would be a briskness to
Right.
the air.
Right. That sharpness that September brings. Yes. I remember
Right.
going outside to do the ponies sometime a while ago thinking, God, it's really nice for September. And then my brain caught up because a little bit fogged in the morning. So, oh, no, no, hang on, it's June. It's not meant to feel like this now. And now it's September and it doesn't feel like September either. So you are many things.
Right.
You're a journalist, you're an author of astonishing books, and you speak at what sound like some of the most interesting conferences I have ever heard of. In all of those things, what is most alive for you at this moment?
Yeah. So, what I've been carrying lately is an understanding of climate possibilities beyond the focus on carbon.
Right.
And one reason that this is so alive to me is that in my own community, I'm seeing what happens when the focus is only on CO2 concentrations. And when that's all you see, what's left out is all of the processes that nature uses to
Right.
regulate our climate.
Right. Not to mention all of the other things that are contributing to the meta crisis. The PFAS in
That
the rain, the microplastics in the clouds, the AI that potentially might be going to eat us, the fact that social media are destroying the emotional lives of the people they're meant to be bringing together. If all you focus on is in the carbon, then the rest goes out the window. You have a lovely story in one of the papers that I read and that I will put into the show notes, people, it will be there, of a dog that you had, which was a brilliant metaphor for this. Can we use your dog as a lead in to how we might look at this differently? Just tell us that little story.
Sure, sure. So we had a wonderful pit bull named Tembi who was very high spirited and very tough. And I remember when might take a walk with her and she would see a rabbit and get all excited. And what was so interesting to me is that her nose would be to the ground and she was searching for that rabbit. But because her nose was to the ground, she wasn't noticing that the rabbit actually just fled away. And had she glanced up, she would have been able to at least chase it more effectively.
Right.
And
Right.
it occurred to me that that's kind of what we're doing with climate,
Yeah.
that we are so focused on carbon, on CO2, that we are missing the real story of climate. And actually, I think it's useful to think of many stories of climate are operating simultaneously.
Yeah.
It's not just one story.
Yeah. Brilliant. I had a working Cocker Spaniel. It's just the same. She put her nose in a scent and her entire world focused on the scent. And exactly that. A squirrel could hop across 2 inches in front of her nose, and she wouldn't notice it was there because scent is everything. And we have got to the same place, or at least our policymakers have got to the same place. And it seems to me, we were talking a few weeks ago on the podcast to Mary Booth of the Partnership for Policy Integrity about the fact that there is a business in the UK that is cutting down very old growth forests in the US and Canada. They have factories now on site that will turn this wood into pellets, and then they ship it across the UK. And they claim not only that it's carbon neutral, that this is helping to get us to net zero because it's neutral. They're claiming that because they plant new trees, it's actually carbon negative. And every single part of that narrative is both intellectually and emotionally and morally wrong. And yet, there is a market in carbon. And we on the podcast refer to the death cult of predatory capitalism. And it seems to me that the death cult is just kind of absorbing narratives of climate change in order to maintain its own momentum and to keep itself going while we are like Wile E. Coyote right out across the canyon. And some of us are looking down and they're trying not to. So in your world and your work, particularly in Reindeer Chronicles, which I have now read 3 times, and it's an amazing book and it's so inspiring. But there seem to me to be people who get this and people who don't. And I don't like putting the world into binaries and us and them. But nonetheless, this is the case. In your explorations of the world, you go and talk to extraordinary people in extraordinary places. Are more of them understanding the complexity, that it's not just about the carbon? And in fact, from what I've been understanding of what you're writing, that water is really important, and the biotic pump and everything that we can do with it. Is that a narrative that's beginning to sink in at a policy level or not yet?
Not yet on a policy level. And one challenge is that carbon is easier to measure
Right.
than, say, how the water cycle is functioning or how forests are functioning. Note that I use the word functioning, which is a verb.
Yes.
So we can think of water as a verb or forests as a verb. And in doing so, that opens up the possibility to really grapple with how things work. So I feel that more people are getting it. But at the same time, I think that there's such an opportunity for people to understand how nature works. Again, nature is a verb, not just a noun. As a colleague of mine, kind of an eco-philosopher, Peter Donovan, says, nature doesn't just sit there and look pretty.
Yeah.
It does work.
It's living. It's
It's
always living. It's an emergent process of life.
absolutely. And to see that, we only need to open our eyes
Yeah.
and ask questions. And how I often think about it is to reconnect with your inner 8-year-old. That all of this that I've needed to do years of reporting and research to understand, it didn't come naturally to me, but all of this is intuitive.
Yeah.
The understanding of nature and how it works and how it is regulating the climate for us all the time, as well as doing all kinds of other things that somewhere we know it.
Yes. Yes. And Indigenous peoples know it anyway. Vanessa Andriotti is very clear that English is 70-80% nouns and their Indigenous language is 70-80% verbs. And exactly as you said, water is a verb, forest is a verb, ocean is a verb. Everything that happens out there is alive and we are an integral part of it. We just kind of have blinkers on. So in service of helping us take the blinkers off, can you explain a little bit about the biotic pump, about the function of how things work when they're working in a healed and whole way, when a forest ecosystem is helping to maintain climate and cool and cycles that we rely on? Because this is something that, until I read your work in depth, I kind of thought I had an overview, and actually I didn't really understand it at all.
Sure, sure. Well, um, let me step back a little bit and explain where the biotic pump understanding comes from. So there is a Russian theoretical physicist named Anastasia Makarieva, and she and her late mentor, Viktor Gorshkov, came up with this understanding. And what happened was they were asking a basic question. And that question was, okay, since we understand that all of our moisture ultimately comes from the ocean, all of our precipitation comes from the ocean, how then do we have rainfall
Hmm.
when we're hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from the seas? So, what they came to see using the tools of physics, which are way beyond my comprehension, and their work involves very intimidating looking equations and symbols and this and that. But eventually it gets down to English. They are very effective in that. Um, they came to understand that it is that there's a that forests are moving
Yeah.
moisture horizontally. So this is it comes from what water does, okay, how water works. And mainly it's, well, water, I think we think about infiltration. That's one thing. Water infiltrates and is held in the land when the land is healthy, when the soil is healthy, and alive. And then there's evapotranspiration,
Hmm. Can you
which
unpick
is,
that?
yes. Okay. So that is, well, let's just say transpiration. Evapotranspiration includes the surface of the earth, but transpiration is the upward movement of moisture through plants, through vegetation.
Right. So draw it up through
So,
the roots and it goes out through the leaves or a leaf equivalent.
yes, yes. So trees, all plants transpire, but trees are super transpirers because they're bigger, because they have all that leaf surface
Right.
and all of those leaves photosynthesizing and releasing moisture through the stomata. And when you have a concentration of trees, as in a forest, an intact forest, there's lots of transpiration happening. And so all this moisture is moving up into the atmosphere. There are two things that are important. Well, many things that are important. One is that that is a cooling mechanism.
Right.
So basically, that's changing liquid water to water vapor, which is what we do when we put on the kettle. And we know that that uses energy. So that consumes energy. So the trees are basically harvesting heat and releasing it as latent heat embodied in water vapor. Now, it doesn't just stay there. As we know, there's a mirror process, mirrored to transpiration, which is condensation. And at that point, heat is released. Now, with all that concentration of transpiration happening, that creates a low pressure zone. Okay. So there's a kind of almost void, which pulls in moisture from elsewhere, ultimately from the ocean. So we've got forests moving moisture horizontally. So that's a really important function. So that is the biotic pump. And what Makarieva and Gorshkov had theorized was that when the biotic pump breaks down, rainfall will cease. And that is what we are seeing happening in real time. in the Amazon rainforest
I read
due to.
today earlier that there is now drought in the rainforest, in a rainforest that hasn't known drought in the entirety of human understanding. There has been no drought. It's a rainforest. It's not designed to be in drought. So is that happening now because a critical mass of the rainforest has been cut down?
Well, the Amazon rainforest is huge.
Okay.
So there are areas where it's functioning. Then there are areas where it is breaking down, and it's from the loss of the forest, from deforestation, but also forest degradation.
Right. Tell us more about that.
So yeah, so right, when it's not just that there's clear cutting, but maybe a loss of trees, loss of health of trees. So the degradation of that system.
Yep.
And one thing that Makarieva points out is that this needs to be, for the biotic pump to function, it needs to be a mature forest. And at the conference that I attended and took part in Munich called Embracing Nature's Complexity, about biotic pump science and communicating biotic pump science, what she really brought home to us was an understanding that there is knowledge in a forest ecosystem. So these trees evolved and established relationships underground through the root system, through the mycorrhizal fungi that are communicating from allowing trees to communicate and to share resources like water and nutrients. So that's really important and kind of bolstered my respect for forests. So if we think of forests as a bunch of sticks of carbon, we will interact with that forest in one way. And it would be like, okay, if we cut down a bunch of trees, but we plant other trees, then our carbon equation is fine. If we understand that the forests are engaged in this process of the biotic pump, that forests are a pump, and that the capacity for that pump to function has evolved through the life of that forest, then it's different. And I want to just mention, because this isn't often talked about when people talk about the biotic pump, and I've only more recently come to understand this, is that the biotic pump also has a really important implication for climate when we're thinking specifically of temperature. So when I mentioned that the forests are harvesting heat and releasing it up higher up in the atmosphere where heat is released. Now, if that is if the biotic pump is functioning. Again, if the biotic pump breaks down, then it doesn't heat, the condensation happens lower down and heat is released where it is interacting with greenhouse gases. And that makes intuitive sense because I'm old enough to have lived in a time when there was more function of when the weather wasn't so weird. So in my bones, I feel it when it's different. And there is a sense of something hovering at closer to the earth, like the biotic pump not working
Yeah.
and, the weather is just kind of stuck.
Yeah. And along with that, one of the factoids in one of the papers that I read was people testing the different temperatures, and they were getting a 30 degrees centigrade difference between the roof of a house and a tree that was at the same height. And then other people have tested grass in an old growth regenerative paddock, and then short grass, dry grasses, and then a tarmac road. And again, they're getting 10 to 20 degree differences. And some of these are livable, and the others basically are not. And so we were talking about policy at the beginning, and reading your book, you're going all around the world, from very hot places up to the Sami and the reindeer. And in each case, there seem to be people on the ground who really get it, who are doing amazing things. And then people who have the responsibility of governance who either willingly or unwillingly don't get it. And I ask this a lot of people on the podcast, and nobody is really able to answer. So if you can't answer, it's fine. But it seems to me, what little I know of the politics in this country. So people like Ed Miliband, he ran quite a fun podcast while he was not in government. And he really seems to care. He kind of gets it insofar as he can. And he definitely wants to make the world a better place. And yet, I have no doubt that he thinks tracks is a wonderful thing because someone has told him that it's contributing to our net zero and this is what matters. How do we change the narrative at a policy level? Is there anybody who's working on that in a way that actually works, that is actually going to get through to, say, Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, please goodness that they end up on November the 5th having the 400 electoral vote swamp that I read today was possible. How do we get through to those, to people at that level? Have you got people that you know of who are working at the narrative stage of that? Or is it just impossible to break through that kind of, I don't know, concrete ceiling?
I don't think it's impossible at all, but I believe it needs to start with people. I think it's a trickle up. I mean, it is interesting how ideas move
Hmm.
through society and how it does so seamlessly in that there's not necessarily a moment that, oh, we understand that the water cycle drives the climate.
Yeah.
And so let's now work to restore the water cycle. But it's kind of when it happens, it's as if it's always been an
Hmm.
understanding.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by seamless.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book that my first book in environmental journalism was about soil
Yeah. Cows
and
saving the planet. I love it.
cows save the planet and other improbable ways of working with soil to heal the earth. And I remember getting emails back from editors, soil and climate. No, I don't think we're interested in that. How does, yeah, just,
Curses.
that doesn't touch my, uh,
It doesn't ring
I
the
forget
bell.
exactly. That
But
doesn't
now
ring a,
it would.
right.
Regenerative ag is huge. There's films, there's books. It's, Gabe Brown and Roots So Deep. It's a big thing now. You were just a bit ahead
Right.
of the curve.
That's what I mean, that there's never any moment
Right. Where it suddenly
that,
became the in thing. Right.
right.
And water, because your next book was about water. So
Correct.
did you have the same pushing up against the river to get that published or did they listen?
Absolutely. Oh, not published, but get listened to.
Okay.
Again, I wrote to many publications saying, please write about this, or, and explained it and how the water cycle. I mean, basically, if you step back and ask yourself, how does the earth manage heat? It comes down to the phase changes of
Yeah.
water. And I
Right.
don't think anybody would argue with that. But then somehow we got caught in this carbon narrative.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to respond to when you mentioned the temperature differences um, of land, of where there's vegetation and where there's a roof. I said that there are many stories of climate. And sometimes what I think about is, or I talk about, is how one story of climate is the story of what happens when solar radiation strikes the earth. Does it does it hit asphalt
Okay.
and become sensible heat? Or does it meet vegetation, meet life,
Right. Yeah.
and is then taken up and through photosynthesis and incorporated into life forms? So plants, and then the plants are engaging with all the microbial life, and then
Or in
Animals
the
are the
ocean when the phytoplankton are they're the basis of the food chain. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I remember listening to Tom Chi a while back. A super bright guy, very invested in business, but he has a scale of from 0 to 3 of the evolution of business, and he said everything comes down to what happened how many bounces a photon has, because it is our energy source, and it is, until the sun burns out, which is not going to be in a time frame we need to worry about. It either, exactly as you said, it hits maybe a white roof and bounces straight back, or it hits something else and perhaps asphalt, and then it's a bit warm, and if you're really cold, you could lie on the asphalt, and that's it. Or exactly as you said, it hits a tree, it hits a plant. It gets absorbed, it gets turned into energy, which might then be eaten by something else, which might then be eaten by something else, and it transits. Or it might hit a solar panel and get turned into power, and then that power is used and then it's gone. And how can we begin to think about maximizing the use of every photon in a way that isn't destroying the rest of the ecosphere? I find that a bit of a reductive way of looking at things, but it's at least interesting that somebody who is inherently reductive and allied to business is thinking about that instead of just thinking about how do we monetize carbon, which is a bit frustrating. Okay, let's take a slight step in another direction. I'm sure everything will loop back together. You have degrees in journalism and in counseling and psychotherapy. And it seemed to me reading the book that a lot of the work that you write about is as much about helping the people to heal and the relationships between the people to heal as it is about healing the land. And there was a particular story, um, Jeff and Bob Chadwick, and I was very
Oh, right.
taken with
Jeff
that.
Goebel and his mentor was Bob
Yes.
Chadwick.
And I remember Jung has a story of Richard Wilhelm, I think, who ends up in a place in China, and there is climate chaos just because there's chaos. And the Taoists try and do something and the Christians pray and everything, and nothing happens. And somebody eventually says, we'll just need to get the wise man, and goes off and brings the wise man back. And the wise man sits for 3 days and says, you all leave me alone. And then the rains come. And Richard Wilhelm goes to him and says, well, how did you do it? And he says something along the lines of, the Tao was out of balance here. I come from a place where the Tao is in balance. I just needed to get the Tao back into balance. And Bob and Jeff in your book are more or less doing exactly this. Bob particularly comes into a group of people who are quite fractious, and there's a lot of difficult energy, and he basically says, bringing you all together is going to make it rain. And Jeff is horrified. Why are you making predictions like that? You're going to completely destroy our credibility. And they get them all to function together, and it rains. And I was so encouraged by the fact that this isn't just something that Jung mentions from some Taoist sage in China. It works in our culture and our time. And that what we need to do is find the ways to bring people together. And I really loved that section of the book where you're in New Mexico and you've got, it's very easy to imagine watching tribalism happening. And now, because it's an election time, you've got basically two lots of people, the ranchers and the people who are in control of the water, and they hate each other. And they get to the point where bullets are flying around and nobody's dead yet, but it's not going to be long. And you manage to bring them together. So that's me talking for a long time, but I was just wanting to bring us to there. And to what extent do you feel that the healing of the people is the healing of the land? Is that a narrative, or am I just picking that out of what I've seen because that's a belief system that I hold?
Absolutely. So there's a filmmaker that I write about named John D. Liu, and I love how he says that our landscapes are a reflection of our consciousness. And it goes both ways. It's hard to be physically and spiritually healthy and vibrant in a degraded landscape. I
Right.
mean, we all kind of intuitively know that when we're in a healthy, beautiful landscape, be it a forest, the coastal area, we
Yeah.
feel good.
Yeah. We go to the
Oh,
sea when we want to relax, or the
right,
mountains, one or the other. Yeah.
right. And in healing landscapes, we are healing ourselves. We are connecting with nature. We are, well, yeah, the healing. It's You see it,
It's
you feel
beautiful.
it.
Yeah, and one of the ones it wasn't John Liu, I think it was Jeff again, of he went to a group and he said, "Okay, what are you afraid of? And what's the worst that could happen? And then what's the best that could happen?" And then he asked a really specific question is, using non-Western methods of agriculture, could you increase your output by 10%? And they're like, "Yeah, no problem." "Could you increase it by 20%?" And they said, "Maybe." "Could you increase it by 50%?" "Absolutely not." And then he asked what I thought was a genius question. He said, "Okay, definitely can't do it, so take all the pressure off. If you were thinking about trying to do it, what would you do?" And they all came up with ideas. And he goes back a few months later, I think, maybe 15
Like
months,
15 months
and
later.
they're
This was
lined up
in
along the
Mali.
road to say to greet him because they'd managed to increase their production by 78%, having said 50% was impossible. And the skills of encouraging people to do that strikes me as huge. But I also then would like to go back to that land in 10, 20, 30 years. Have they increased production using non-Western methods, but are they working with the land or are they acting at the land? If that makes that distinction makes sense. At the basis that Western industrial agriculture is imposing on land to say maximize production. We don't really care anything else happens. We can poison the water. We can turn the soils into basically inert growing media, but we'll get production of something. But I'm assuming these people were producing good stuff in a way that was harmonious with the land. Am I right?
It's been a while, so I think that this was a series of workshops that
Right.
Jeff did in Mali,
Right.
when there were 12 warring tribes and um, food insecurity was 85%. I know that as he's been in touch with them through the years, it has those habits and what they learned did stay,
Okay.
did continue. And I believe that they did continue to hold community meetings in this new way, this new, more collaborative way. I just don't know for sure because there are so many other
A
forces.
lot of
I don't know
variables.
what the situation
Yes.
is now, but yeah, there really is a magic that happens when the pivot for me when I've looked at many of these cases and been involved in workshops myself is given that it's impossible,
Hmm.
if it were possible, what would you do?
Right.
And that once you say given that it's impossible, it takes the pressure off. Then you can engage your imagination. Well, if it were possible, I'd do this. And I got so enamored of this, so excited about the possibilities that I set up a website, dotheimpossible.earth. And a group of us are looking for ways to bring this consensus process to anybody who's interested.
Oh, tell me more
And
about that because I hadn't found that one. So do the impossible.earth. I'll put it in the show notes.
yeah,
What's
yeah,
happening with that?
it's very much a work in progress. We're figuring out how to do it. And basically, so after the book came out, it was COVID time, and Jeff put together a consensus institute online with people in the US, the Northeast, and a lot of people out West, and people in Australia, because those were the people who were the groups that were particularly interested. And then many of us had decided we want to just keep this work going. So there are two main components. One is, as I described, that, you explained, what is the worst possible outcome? And the reason that that is asked first is that often we hold that fear.
Mhm.
We might not even be conscious of it, but we're kind of paralyzed by what we fear could happen.
Yeah. And we don't want to give
And
voice to it. But when we're given
right,
the opportunity to give voice to it amongst others and discover we're not the only person who holds these fears, it's incredibly liberating, I imagine.
absolutely. And in our own kind of body and psyche, that frees us
Yeah.
to open up to other possibilities. Then it's the best possible outcome. Then it's if if this were if this weren't impossible, if it were possible. So that's the belief systems
Right.
get kind of opened up,
Yeah.
get freed. So it's challenging the belief. that is impossible.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
or the belief that I'm helpless. So, so it works on belief systems. Then the other really, really important component, and this I think is important for all of our land challenges because it's all about humans and
Mhm.
relationships
Mhm.
and our fears and our stresses. So listening to others is crucial in this process. And the flip side of that is when someone feels that they have been heard, their capacity to engage and how conflicts kind of take a different shape.
Mm. Yeah.
Because when we feel that we're not being heard, then we're constrained.
Yeah.
And if we feel that people have power over us, then we kind of, feel frustration towards that power. And that doesn't lead to a scenario where people can work together.
Yeah. And so much of the politics of our world, your country, my country, half of Europe, it seems to me that a lot of the enraged reacting and moving into rage-filled political spaces is because there's that lack of agency. There's not the Sarah Schlotter, who's an amazing Equisoma practitioner, talks about feeling felt and getting gotten. And what I loved about what you were describing in the book that Jeff does, again in the Southwest, was he had two people on opposing sides sit and talk to each other, and he had two other people reflecting what they were saying in the moment so that they knew they had been heard. And that seemed to really shift things. And I'm wondering, there were a couple of other stories in the book. The Reindeer Chronicles that it takes its name from was the Sami, who a young man had been told he had to basically cull most of his reindeer to the point where he wouldn't be able to survive. And that this was ecologists had decided there were too many reindeer. And then other ecologists had decided they were wrong. But nobody had asked the Sami who rely on them. And it seemed an occasion where the people whose lives are most impacted were not being heard and getting gotten. Have they been heard since? Have you heard anything since you wrote the book?
Well, what's happening now is that there is much greater attention to the actual dynamics,
Okay.
the ecological dynamics in I mean, this is Norway that I was researching.
Right.
And I think that the general culture is listening more to the Sami as they are
Okay.
kind of at the forefront of climate related changes. But yeah, I'm not convinced that it's, it could be more so because I believe the Sami have more to teach the rest of us about how the animals interact with the land and how humans can best manage those animals. So just to kind of bring listeners up to date on this is that the government was mandating the culling of reindeer because they believed that there were too many reindeer and that was impairing the and threatening the fragile tundra ecosystem. But what they didn't understand is that the reindeer were actually maintaining this very cold ecosystem. So in the summer, browsing and grazing, the reindeer were managing trees. So there's a phenomenon with the changing climate in the far north called shrubification. That because it's warmer, there's trees are like what would have been small shrubs are growing bigger.
And then it's darker.
And right.
Right.
And so that's absorbing heat.
Yeah, and you're losing the albedo effect. You're doing both. You're absorbing more and reflecting less.
Exactly. So the reindeer are browsing on the shrubs and small trees. So Yes.
Okay.
So the heath, the lighter colored grasses, the heath dominates and
Right.
you get more reflection. And then in the winter months with the snow, the animals, which in the winter, the reindeer are moved in vast herds that the herders bring their animals together and they're moving across the landscape in tremendous numbers. So all that trampling presses down the snowpack.
Right.
And that sounds like a negative thing. Don't we want that nice fresh snow? But that snowpack actually was an insulator. It
Okay.
insul
Like an
it
igloo.
had
Yeah. Ice
right.
acts as
So
insulation.
it was protecting
Right.
the soil
Right.
from the extreme cold. Whereas when the reindeer are pressing down the snowpack, then the soil is exposed to the cold, and that's keeping the ground frozen.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, so the government didn't understand that.
Yeah. It seems they've got a Western narrative of overgrazing, which is, when we put 100 cows on 10 acres, they will overgraze it completely. But this is a whole ecosystem where the reindeer have been part of the ecosystem for presumably centuries, if not millennia.
Right,
Right.
right. So, yeah, I do a lot of work on how animals are governing, what their ecological impact is,
Right.
because it's
Right.
not always obvious, like the reindeer,
Yeah.
like
And
donkey
like the
in
donkeys
Australia.
in Australia. Tell us, because that's so interesting, is the concepts of megafauna. We want original indigenous megafauna, but sadly they're all gone. But we don't want introduced megafauna because they are bad, because we've got this kind of bizarre idea of colonialization, and yet the donkeys are actually fulfilling a really interesting niche. Tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us, have the government got their head around that one?
Okay, so that's another work in progress. So I've been exploring and writing about a family, the Henglers, who manage an area of land in the Kimberley. So this is like the outback of the outback. It's extremely remote. It's an
And it's
area of
huge.
land the size of Singapore,
Yeah, yeah,
and one can only get there by helicopter.
right,
So the Henglers, and it's Chris Hengler, who I generally talk to, their product is restored land.
right,
That is the purpose of what they are doing. And they've been doing that with cattle. They've been doing restorative, holistic grazing and have improved the land markedly
right.
from the early 1990s. Uh, One challenge with audio podcast is I can't show you the before and after pictures, but you can certainly look up Kachana Station. So anyway, they were doing their work with the cattle, and then the donkeys showed up. Donkeys were brought to rural Australia as pack animals, as Western settlers began to make inroads in the outback.
Because you can brutalize donkeys a lot more than you can horses before they drop dead, basically, yes.
Yeah, yeah, that's basically it. And then when mechanized transport came in and the donkeys weren't needed, they were just set free. And donkeys live a long time, upwards of 40 years often. And so they were forming bands and communities and moving around and kind of, surviving and even thriving. So at Kachana Station, the donkeys showed up, and very quickly Chris and his father observed that the donkeys were going places where the cattle wouldn't go. They could handle rougher terrain.
Right.
So they were bringing moisture and fertilizer and to that area, and they were eating the vegetation that otherwise would have dried out during the dry season and become fire fodder.
Right.
So the land where the donkeys were was healthier. Now, the government however, said donkeys are not native. So they're going to be using the resources that our native animals, wildlife, would otherwise use. So we have to get rid of the donkeys. So Western Australia has been fit, and that's a very large state geographically where Kachana is. They're fairly determined to eradicate donkeys. So it's been this ongoing process of trying to educate government officials so that they understand what the donkeys are doing for us. So there are scientists that have been working with Kachana Station that have found extraordinary things. So for one example is that they understand that donkeys dig wells. So they're digging wells and bringing up water
Wow.
so that they have the water, but also
Everything else has water. Hey, look, guys, we
everything else.
found water. Woo! Gosh.
Right. And
Sure.
they move brush around in a way that serves small marsupials, that creates a favorable conditions for them, and many of these species are endangered. And the donkeys then, a scientist named Arian Wallach talks about invisible megafauna. So it's animals that are in the landscape but are not native,
Yep.
but yet are having an impact on the landscape. She found that donkeys and other introduced megafauna
Camels, I
are
think, was the other
still
one.
camels and I think Cape buffalo,
Oh, okay. Wow.
that they are filling an ecological niche that has been void since the end of the late Pleistocene.
Right.
So we know that Australia has very thin, kind of nutrient poor soil, and much of the Australian landscape is very vulnerable to fire.
Hmm.
Well, that's a reflection of the lack
Of the
of
megafauna.
megafauna
Right. Right.
in the landscape.
Interesting. And I was reading a paper a couple of days ago saying 800,000 years ago, so roughly the Pleistocene, and humanity was down to 1,280 breeding functional units. They've done this looking at DNA. It's really interesting. They've looked at bottlenecks in DNA evolution, and that there must, they suggest, have been an extraordinary climatic crisis at that point. We don't necessarily know what it is, but people were not coping very well. And there's been this colonial concept, patriarchal, predatory capital concept that obviously people hunted the megafauna out of existence because they could, which isn't necessarily untrue, but I think there's an increasing suggestion that maybe they just died. At around the time, there was this, 1,200 people total. We are all related to those 1,200 people. Every single one of us goes back to one of those, two of those, effectively. So I think that struck me as interesting. And I was reading Tyson Young-Comporta's new book, Right Story, Wrong Story. Have you read it?
No.
It's really, really interesting. And he says a number of very interesting things. But the one that came to mind while you were talking was he's describing the making of a dugout canoe. And he's very cleverly, it's a very clever book because in the Aboriginal way of speaking, time is not linear, but he's trying to create it linear enough that we in the West can cope with it. And he's talking about the adults finding the log and beginning to shape it into a canoe, and the children are playing games, jumping off a bend in the north bank of the river into the water because today it is safe and tomorrow it won't be. And he just drops that in and leaves it. And then about 100 pages later on, he says, we, the people of the right story, the Aboriginals, don't have the Paleolithic fight and flight response that you all speak of because we know where the predators are always. And I thought, I wonder how much of our narratives of how the world was are making assumptions of our brains function like this, therefore their brains function. We have fight and flight, therefore they must have had fight and flight. We are scared of snakes, they must be scared of snakes. And actually, they know where the predators are always. And I am putting that together with the Sami and with all around the world where you're talking about indigenous peoples, and wondering how many of the ones, say the Sami, or the native Australians, or the native North Americans or South Americans, live in that world of verbs where everything is connected. And wouldn't it be interesting to bring Tyson into the land to see the dreaming of the land and see how the land is responding to the donkeys or the camels or the Cape buffalo? Because it may be that the land really welcomes them, and that there is a narrative that is missing from our way of telling stories. Because our way is X number of donkeys create this in the ecosystem, and this is either good or bad, depending on your viewpoint. And we either want to machine gun them from helicopters or we want to keep them going. But wouldn't it be interesting to bring in Tyson and people like him who can talk to the land and ask it what it thinks and give it a
Right.
voice?
Yes, there was one quote I remember from that I put in the book from an Aboriginal elder who, rather than railing against the presence of the donkeys or they don't belong here or we need to control them, he simply said they belong to this land.
Yeah. 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 But getting the politicians to take that on board is going to be hard. So since you wrote the book, is there movement on that at all?
Um, so there is more awareness. I know that there will soon be a lot of media in Australia about this.
Okay. There's some stories being seeded out.
Yes, there
Yes.
are stories being seeded and recorded,
Excellent.
and it's still in a stalemate, but it's not one of those moments when there's going to be a hearing on X date and
Okay.
the donkeys may
Be
have to
exterminated
go.
thereafter. Right. Because
Right,
there must
right,
be epigenetic change in the donkeys. I'm aware there's a group of ponies called the Carnedii, a little bit west of here, who are feral Welsh mountain ponies. They're on the side of Snowdon. And a few years ago, when it still got cold in this country, it went down to, I think, minus 35, and quite a lot of them died. But the ones that survived, because there's quite a lot of people interested in them, had undergone epigenetic change in that span. In surviving, their DNA was actually different. And so I am also imagining that, you know how donkeys, a lineage of donkeys, you'll have, great, great, great grandparents of the foals that are being born now that are in real time adapting to that landscape. And if somebody decides it's fun to wipe them all out, and then somebody else 10 years down the line realizes that actually donkeys were quite good, you have to start that process all over again and get neo-acclimatized donkeys. And you can't just kind of fly them in from Europe and go, hey, go on, enjoy, and expect them all to survive. So treating that as a precious resource strikes me as being quite important. If somebody could do the epigenetics on the donkeys, that would be interesting.
right, and that's knowledge, and
Yeah.
just how I spoke earlier about how there is knowledge in the forest.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And Daniel Firth Griffith is doing amazing things on his 400 acres in the Appalachians he has families of cattle and he lets them roam. And then he's getting intergenerational, transgenerational and descendant knowledge of that land that's being bred into the cattle. You
Right,
end up with a kind of land race that has adapted to your land. So
right,
yeah.
and nutrition,
Yeah.
because animals know what their bodies need,
Yeah.
but if humans are controlling what they eat, if
Yeah.
they're feeding them grain and hay and all of that,
Yeah.
then they lose that knowledge.
Yep. Yes, and that's when they eat things that are poisonous, because in the wild, animals are not wandering around killing themselves eating the wrong things, and it's not because they're not there, it's because they know what to eat, when to eat it. The ivy is safe at this time of year, not safe at that time of year. But if your horse is starving and the only green thing in sight is some ivy, it's going to eat it, and then you're going to be a bit sad. Oh gosh, there are so many things we could talk about here. Um, You talked before we came online, you said you'd been to a book launch in New York, and that sounded really exciting. Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to be involved in it, and tell us a bit about what the launch was like, because that sounded lovely.
Yeah, so this is a book, edited and written by said edited because there are many contributors, by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who is a marine biologist, a professor, and a climate activist. And the book is called What If We Get It Right?
I love that title. Yes.
Yeah. So it's interviews with 20 people who she describes as her teachers.
Of whom you are
And
one?
I am one of them.
Oh, fantastic. Well done, that one.
Thank you. And it was really exciting, I have to say. I'm still kind of buzzing from it because it wasn't your typical book launch and it wasn't your typical kind of publicity discussion of a climate book. What she did was put together a climate variety show and brought humor and fun
Right. Oh,
into and music
joy.
and
Woohoo.
yes, there was a magician into this.
And was the
And
magician doing climatey things? Was he taking, I don't know, little baby
oh,
mountains and making the rain fall on them?
so it was she,
Oh, sorry,
and
assumption on my
what
part.
she was doing, well, first of all, she was saying that what we do is magic,
Huh.
bringing climate solutions to the fore and really grappling with climate solutions. So she was doing magic and showing how we are a community that we can read each other's minds without knowing that we could, and she could read our minds and all of that. Um, yes, the magician did something very interesting. She had 3 rings and showed how they can we don't think that they can be interconnected, but they can be interconnected, and she did that with her magician toolkit.
Interesting.
But then it came clear that those 3 circles created a Venn diagram,
Oh, yes.
and Venn diagrams are one of Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's favorite things,
Right.
and she often uses this in a climate sense, that what is your role in climate? So you have interlocking circles. What am I good at? What needs to be done? And what gives me joy?
Right.
And where those 3 meet is your
Ah,
climate superpower
right.
and what you can do. But there was a dinner that for contributors the evening before, and I was stunned that people I was meeting were comedians.
Right.
So I
Right.
had to kind of, okay, how does this work?
Right.
And there are comedians working on climate to engage people, to get kind of start people thinking in creative ways,
Yeah.
to bring in the element of surprise. And it was incredibly high spirited, this climate
Fantastic.
variety show. They had contests, they had a woman who was talking about the sex lives of animals while she was using a hula hoop.
Wow.
And yeah, yeah. And the show Ted Lasso, the character and the writer of that show, Jason Sudeikis, he was the co-host
Wow.
with
She got some
Ayana.
really sparkly
Yeah,
people. Fantastic.
yeah.
Policymakers? Were there any policymakers in the room, do you think?
Actually, yes. One woman
Yes.
is a special assistant to the U.S. president on climate,
Okay.
and
Doesn't get much higher
one
up the tree
woman
than that.
is a like a Native American liaison to the Kamala Harris campaign.
Fantastic.
Yeah, there were all kinds of different roles that people play.
Right.
One woman works at NASA.
Okay.
So there were
Right.
farmers, there were writers, there were
Brilliant.
policymakers and scientists,
Right. As well
researchers.
as comedians and magicians and presumably
Exactly.
singers and
Yeah.
brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant.
And some of those professors and scientists were very funny.
Right. Right, turn out to be multi-talented. Yes. Right. Oh, that's so good. That's so heartening. Thank you. That's really cheered me up. So we're almost at the end of our time, but I'm wondering, where are you going next? Because you're so prolific. You write so much, you end up going around the world to conferences in lots of different places and then visiting people who are doing amazing projects. What next will we see from you?
Well, I can say that one thing I've been doing more of is bringing that work home. So getting involved in, in what's happening here in
Okay, in
Vermont.
Vermont. Right.
So, for example, there is a solar array that involves cutting more than 40 acres of healthy, intact forest.
No,
So,
to
getting
put up solar
involved.
panels.
Right,
Oh God.
right. So, one concept that came out of that conference in Munich on the biotic pump that I'm thinking a lot about now is climate sensitivity, and feeling that that to bring that understanding to the forefront. What climate sensitivity
Thank you.
is the amount of warming per increase in CO2, per increase in the greenhouse
Yep.
gas impact, which seems to me really important, because that's what effect is this actually happening.
Right.
So, where that becomes meaningful is, let's say that you have a place that's full of roads and sidewalks and parking
Concrete.
lots and, right, concrete world. Per rise in CO2, that place is going to get very hot
Right.
because it's holding the heat,
Yeah.
because of what
Because
happens
there's no
when
transpiration.
sun.
There is no biotic pump.
Exactly. Right. When sunlight hits the ground, it creates heat. Whereas if you have a healthy forest next to a healthy grassland, that those natural systems are creating a buffer
Right.
for that heat, because there is transpiration, because there is the production of clouds, which requires natural processes
Mm.
driven by plants. So it seems to me that restoring the ecosystems, the health of the ecosystems, is work that we can do that will make a difference, that creates a buffer,
It
as
increases
Anastasia.
resilience, doesn't it?
Right. What she said is, it's harder to heat up that
Yeah.
landscape when you have healthy vegetation.
And does
So
it work
that's
even
what
if you have, say, grass roofs on the buildings and maybe growing things up the walls of the buildings, and then you take some of your parking lots and shade them over and put grass there? Is that even a
Oh, yeah,
worthwhile strategy? Okay.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
But that requires more resources, and most municipalities haven't chosen to put resources into that, and
Right.
private citizens haven't been called to do so either. But we can.
And over here, we'd have planning laws that would go, "Oh, no, you can't do that. It doesn't look right. Like, we're in the middle of the six-mass extinction, and you're worried about what style the windows are." And I'm also thinking, presumably there's a trade-off of dead trees are worth more than live trees. We cut down the forest, we get some money, and then we can put our solar park and we get some more money, which is not grand, but if you need money in your cash-strapped city, county, district council, then you do that. Is there an option to get a group of people together to go, "No, let's have the solar panels on the roof of, every public building instead of cutting down the forest and putting it there?" Is that a thing?
Well, what has been a thing is that with all the incentives for green energy, big corporations that are basically holding
Mhm.
companies, and if trace it
Follow the
back to
money.
where it
It's
begins,
BlackRock.
it's often fossil fuel companies.
Yes.
They are investing for the carbon credits,
Oh
and
god.
they're driving this.
Yeah.
So really exploiting the good intentions of the state.
Yep. So we're looping back to the beginning of everybody's focused on the carbon, like your dog was focused on the scent, and there's money to be made in it. And then everybody ticks their inner box of I was feeling guilty, but I've done my bit and everything's fine. And so the system can carry on because now it's all going to be fixed. And nobody
Right.
understands complexity as a thing, and this is not fixing it. Oh, I hope your narrative of what happens if we get it right is spread. So are you holding public meetings and talking to people or talking to people in the supermarket? What are you doing to change things where you live? And if the answer is nothing, that's fine. I'm just assuming you're going to be doing something.
Oh, doing as much communicating as I can
Right.
at public meetings and in the newspaper and on radio, and working with other community activists who are learning
Right.
from this process.
Yeah.
Because when it began, most of us only heard that solar energy will save
Yeah.
us.
We need all these
Well,
electric vehicles urgently, so we have to have lots of solar. It's yeah.
right. And solar energy has many, many benefits, but it's not going to save us
No.
if we destroy the ecosystems to put up solar.
Yeah.
So I'm very involved in that. And then I'm involved in on my own land, putting in plants um to support native pollinators,
Right.
because that's something that anybody can do. I began the Reindeer Chronicles by saying
Did.
that people always ask me what they can do.
Yes.
And I always say, start where you are.
Yes.
So I'm choosing to take my own medicine and
Yeah.
start where I am. And it's right outside the window where I am,
Great
where I've planted a lot of
stuff.
native plants.
And so 2 questions very quickly before we end. Are you finding you're having to plant non-native plants because the native ones are being assaulted by the changing climate? And is it working? Because we've had a year where the insect numbers have plummeted. It's absolutely terrifying. Are you seeing that too?
Not plummeting. We have a lot of wonderful insects, which I enjoy. And I know that when you plant them, by putting in the plants, the insects do show up.
Right.
So we have that capacity here in New England,
Right. Make the most of it.
which I don't take for granted.
Yeah, because there's lots of places in the world that you've been to where that's much, much harder. Judith, thank you. This has been really amazing. Is there anything in closing that you wanted to say that we haven't covered yet?
No, I don't think so. Just inviting people to engage with nature and understand that nature is working
Yeah.
and it's not just looking pretty.
Yeah, and if we allow it, nature heals with remarkable speed. We just have to kind of stop bashing it on the head with a hammer every single day. Thank you. And I have your website already in the show notes. I will find the other website and I'll link to all of your books. Are there any places I might not have found that I should go looking for? Able
It
to
seems
find you?
to me like you've done some pretty good
I think so.
excavation work.
All right, I will send you the show notes and you can check. And if there's anything that I've missed, people, it will be there by the time you get this. Great. Grand. We're there. Thank you so much for your time and for everything that you're doing. Genuinely, your
Well,
books are
well,
amongst the
thank
most inspiring that I've read. So I'm very grateful.
well, thank you so much for the opportunity to chat.
Thank you. We'll do it another time. But for now, thank you for coming on to the Accidental Gods podcast.